Welcome to my next video lecture here for the American Economic History online course here at Rutgers University. And what I'm going to do here in this video lecture is take a look at monopoly pricing, and particularly when we want to relate this to railroads and the issues that came about with regulating railroads. And I'm going to give you a little graphical example of an explanation of what the railroads did and why they managed to annoy a number of groups of people and got them to agitate for regulation of the railroads. So if we take a look at this, you can see that I have demand curve, marginal revenue curve, and I also have an average total cost curve and marginal cost curve. Just to simplify things, I have these combined as one curve. I have that average total cost equals marginal cost. You can see that marginal cost is constant. The other thing that I've assumed here is that fixed costs are equal to zero. And all this is not a very tenable assumption, but the reason I'm doing this is just to simplify the analysis in order for visually for you to be able to understand and to see quite easily the comparison between monopoly pricing and pricing in perfect competition. So just realize that I made that assumption about average total cost and marginal cost simply to make it visually more appealing and easier to understand when I do this analysis. So if we assume that this firm is a profit maximizer, marginal cost equaling marginal revenue is going to be the profit maximizing output level. So here we have where marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal to one another, the quantity associated with that. So if we go from that quantity up to the demand curve, and if we go from that point across, that gives us the price in a monopoly market. So let me put price monopoly here, P sub M, and I will do the same for Q, Q sub M. So here we have the monopoly pricing and monopoly output. Just grouping those together so that you can see. So I got that output level where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and that's the quantity I got. I follow that quantity up to the demand curve and across, and that gives me the price of a monopolist. What would this output level be if we were in a perfectly competitive market? If you remember, in a perfectly competitive marketplace, that price, demand, and marginal revenue are the same. They would be equivalent to one another. So in order to get the perfectly competitive output level, we will go to where marginal cost intersects the demand curve. So if we go from that point there and straight down, that gives us the output level in a perfectly competitive marketplace. So this is the output, so that's Q, and we'll say sub PC for perfect competition. So if we compare these two pricing and output levels, and price will be equal to average total cost and marginal cost. So the price in perfect competition under the assumptions I've illustrated here to you. Here is the price in perfect competition, and here is the quantity in a perfectly competitive marketplace. So what can we do? Well, we can compare output in a perfectly competitive marketplace versus monopoly. We can see from this illustration that the output in a perfectly competitive marketplace is greater than it is in a monopoly market. So what we can say here is that a monopolist is restricting output. The output is lower. Here's the output, what it would be in a perfectly competitive marketplace, and here's what it actually is in this monopoly market, that we see that output has been restricted by the monopolist. And in restricting the output, we can see that the price is higher. So here's the price in a perfectly competitive marketplace, here's the price in a monopoly marketplace, so you can see that the price in a monopoly market is higher. The reason being is the monopolist is able to restrict output and raise price by doing so. So what is the impact on consumers? Well, economists would measure this by measuring the level of consumer surplus under both scenarios. And if you remember, or if you've never, or if you've forgotten about what consumer surplus is the area above price but below demand. So for example, if I were to map out or illustrate to you what the consumer surplus is in this marketplace, I would just look to the price and demand. So the area above price but below the demand curve. So this triangle that's represented by this shade, the price and demand curve, gives us the area of consumer surplus. So let me actually highlight that for you. And let me pick a color. Let me pick a light color. It'd be easier. So if I highlight this region here, the area between the demand curve and price, that area right here is the consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive marketplace. So the area above price but below demand, that area, that shaded area in light blue, is the consumer surplus. Let's compare that to the consumer surplus in a monopoly market. Again, remember that consumer surplus is the area above price but below demand. So here is our price, and there is the demand curve. The area between those two is consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive marketplace. Let me pick a darker color just to contrast it. And there you can see the area of consumer surplus. So here is the consumer surplus, the dark blue area in a monopoly market, and this light blue area, which includes this here, this entire area here is a consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive marketplace. So from a welfare perspective, we can see that the consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive market is greater than the consumer surplus in a monopoly market. The reason being is that in this monopoly, remember what I told you is the monopolist restricts output. So consumers are producing less, which means they're generating less consumer surplus from the consumption of less goods, and consumer surplus has declined because the price is higher. The price in the monopoly market is greater than the price in the perfectly competitive marketplace. So both the higher price and the lower consumption contribute to the lower consumer surplus in a monopoly market. So I just did that to illustrate to you what control, the ability to set pricing in a market, the impact on consumers. And this is the argument that people are making with railroads, is that they had market power, and they were using that market power to quote-unquote price gouge. I mean, as an economist, I don't know what price gouging actually is. But in a public policy perspective, that's, raising prices at inopportune times for individuals. So that's what the railroads were accused of doing. So let's further take a look at this, and we'll take this to a further extension, that instead of just looking at a monopolist who charges one price and has one output level, if you have a degree of monopoly power, you can engage in price discrimination. And price discrimination means charging different prices that don't reflect different costs of production. And what I'm going to illustrate to you is the extreme of this perfect price discrimination, where the seller of product is able to charge the highest price every individual in the market is willing to pay. And what I want to do is illustrate to you the profits that accrue to a monopolist when they only charge one price and one output level, versus the profits that a monopolist will have if they can engage in perfect price discrimination. So let me get rid of some of these highlighted areas because I don't need them anymore. And let me put in what the profits of a monopolist are. Remember, profits are the difference between total cost and total revenue. So to find the area of total revenue, what I need to know is price and quantity. If I multiply price and quantity together, I get total revenue. So this entire rectangle here that's bounded by the X and Y axis and P, QM, and PM, this entire rectangle here is the total revenue. Total cost is just average total cost multiplied by Q, which gives us the area below this, the average total cost curve, and up to QM. All right, so the entire rectangle bounded by QM and PM is total revenue, and the entire rectangle bounded by average total cost and QM. This bottom part here is total cost. So total revenue is represented by, profits for monopolist that charges one price at one output level is equal to this area here. So this blue area here is the profits of monopolist. And actually, yeah, that's fine. I'll leave it that color. All right, or yeah, I'll leave it that. I might change it later on. So here's the profits of a monopolist that's just charging one price and one output level. Let's compare that to the profits of the monopolist who is able to engage in perfect price discrimination. Well, a monopolist that engages in perfect price discrimination, their output level will be equal to where marginal cost is equal to demand. So instead of so that's the same as the perfectly competitive output level, but let me put QPD for price discrimination. So that's the output of price discrimination. They will continue to increase their output level as long as price is above marginal cost. Once the price falls below marginal cost, they will stop producing. The reason being is, why would you sell something for less than it costs you to produce? For example, if marginal cost is equal to $5 and the price past this QPD is equal to $10, why would you produce something at a cost of $5, at a cost of $10, and then sell it for a price of $5? So just realize that a perfectly price discriminating monopolist will increase output until marginal cost is equal to demand. Because once we get to Q's past that point, the price of that product falls below the marginal cost, which means it's costing you more to produce the item than you're actually generating in revenue. So realize that Q is going to be equal to PD, and that's where marginal cost intersects the demand curve. What's going to be the area of profits? Well, remember, under perfect price discrimination, that means that this firm is able to charge the highest price to every single individual. So it means that total revenue is going to be equal to the entire area below the demand curve up to PD. So if we subtract off the cost, which is going to be QPD times average total cost, so it's going to be the area below this and to the left of QPD, that will give you this region in here, which is going to be total cost. Total revenue is going to be the area below the demand until we get to QPD. So the difference is going to be, let me highlight it for you instead of talking about it. It'd probably be much easier to see it than for me to describe it. The profits of a monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination is going to be this entire light blue area. And actually, let me delete this out and do this in reverse order. It'll be easier for everyone to see. Here is the area of profits for a monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination. Okay, and let me bring in and highlight the area of profits for a monopolist who just charges one price and has one output level. So this is the area of profits for a monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination versus the profits of a monopolist who charges only one price and has one output level. You can see that the profits when you successfully engage in perfect price discrimination are much greater than if you are a one price, one quantity monopolist. All right. The main thing to remember about this is there's a couple of things. Number one, how is the quantity determined for perfect price discrimination? It's determined the same way as we would determine in a perfectly competitive marketplace. It's where marginal cost intersects the demand curve, and that gives you the total output level of a monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination. How do we determine the profits? It's the area above average total cost but below the demand curve. So this entire shaded triangle right here are the profits of the monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination. Here are the profits that accrue to a monopolist who maximizes profits, but what they're doing is only setting one price and one output. So a monopolist engaging in perfect price discrimination is charging multiple prices. In actuality, is charging the highest price every individual is willing to bear, up to the point where they get to where marginal cost is equal to the demand curve, and that's the limit on their output level. If you compare this to what we did with the consumer surplus in the previous example, you can see is what the monopolist who engages in perfect price discrimination, what they've done is they've managed to convert all consumer surplus into profits. If you remember previously that when we looked at perfect competition, this area here was equal to what? It was equal to consumer surplus. Now it's equal to the monopoly profit. So the ability to engage in perfect price discrimination, what it allows the monopolist to do is to convert consumer surplus into additional profits above the profit maximizing amount. Now I know you might be sitting there thinking, well, you just said where marginal revenue equals marginal cost is profit maximization. That is profit maximization when we produce one quantity and charge one price. It's exclusive of price discrimination. Price discrimination allows us to charge different prices to different people, and the reason why monopolists would want to do this is because it, as we can see here, it increases their profits. And you can see here, if this is the example, consumer surplus is equal to zero because all consumer surplus that existed under perfect competition has been converted over to profits for the perfectly price discriminating monopolist. I hope that was of some help. I think it's a little better illustration than the one that's in your textbook. And realize that this was a major complaint against the railroads during this time period, that they were charging different prices to different groups of people, and that in particular, if there were regions or rail lines that had very little competition, your per mile per ton rate would be higher than individuals who were shipping over more highly competitive rail lines. So people, especially farmers in the Midwest, were very upset about the fact that price discrimination was occurring in the railroad markets. They couldn't understand why, if I'm shipping something 100 miles, why I'm paying more than somebody who's shipping something 1,000 miles. The explanation is that there was no competition on that shorter route, and they were able to charge a much higher rate than they could on a route that had a number of competitors that they had to deal with. So once again, I hope this helps. I think it's important to understand the notion of monopoly power, the ability to set pricing and price discrimination, because it's very important when we talk about railroads, in particular when we start seeing the introduction of legislation to regulate the activities of railroads.